Hello, Philippines, and welcome to the World News Jam right here on DZRJ 810 AM on your radio dial and RJTV channel 224 on Sky Cable right here in Manila. Also on the RJ Facebook page, TV Plus boxes, and YouTube. My name is Eric Lecain. We here at the Jam bring you the most interesting stories to discuss some of the most interesting stuff that's on the news this week. Stories going on in the world, to bring the world to you, the Philippines, so you know more about what's going on. This week we'll be talking about what is underneath the ocean in the Philippines, the final chapter to the basketball star being held in a Russian prison, all about the no-sex law that just got passed in Indonesia. Also, is someone trying to overthrow the government in Germany? The new signs of domestic terrorism in the U.S. and Donald Trump's worst week ever. All this and much, much more here on The Jam. Every Sunday, 7 p.m. right here on DZRJ and RJTV. So let's get on the roller coaster of smartness and let our brains take a ride. Oil. Ever since we discovered that it can be used to bring us light, heat, transportation, it has been the lifeblood of modern society. Now we fight over it, we trade for it, we even die for it. People that were poor became rich over it. Starving countries almost overnight became products of unlimited wealth because of it. The country of Qatar was a small, insignificant country that mined pearls. Then they found the largest natural gas reserve underneath its ocean, and now they are hosting the World Cup, which they bought and paid for, allegedly. Now, I and many others have always thought that maybe the Philippines could be sitting on the top of something very similar. You know, for years, people have speculated that the Philippine Sea could be a treasure trove full of minerals and petroleum, all these types of assets just waiting to be exploited. The problem is, we're just guessing. We don't really know for sure. That's the problem with finding oil. You really don't know exactly. You just spend millions of dollars poking at it just to see if, well, some of it might come out. Now, the possible area in question was deemed to the Philippines. It was their land, their piece of ocean, after the Aquino administration got the World Court to officially say it was. Even though China heavily contested, it was the biggest court, said that the Philippines was the owner. Then Duterte came in, said he did not want to enforce the decision because it was China. According to him, you can't win a war with China. But now we have President Marcos, who is saying, why don't we just take a look? Doesn't hurt to take a look. Let's not even ask the Chinese. This week, Marcos kind of said, why not? He said, that's the big thing. It's a big thing for us. This is why we need to fight for what is ours and take advantage if there really is oil there. Now, there was once a thought of having a joint exploration with China, maybe share it. But that seems to be all over now. Well, maybe sort of, but maybe still on the table. It's hard to tell. It's always hard to tell with China. This all comes just after a meeting between the Vice President of the U.S. and the Philippine President, in which the U.S. military may be coming back to the Philippines, or is definitely coming back to the Philippines. Of course, if the Philippines went out into the ocean and started poking around, the Chinese would probably scurry them back to land. But if they knew that there was a U.S. battleship parked off the coast of the Philippines, I wonder if they would try the same old bullying type tactics. I mean, as of now, Philippines relies entirely on imported oil. They have to pay whatever the price is. If there's some kind of problem off on the other side of the world that affects the oil prices, then the Philippines has to deal with the residual effects of that. But what if the Philippines could drill and refine its own oil? Think of what that would mean to this country. In Qatar, the country was poor. The citizens were poor. But once they found the oil and the gas, each citizen became rich. Now, the wealth per citizen is one of the highest in the world in Qatar. there's one other issue we have to think about. If there is oil there, well, how do we get it? Oil in the ground is different than oil in the land. It's one thing, however, if oil is under the sea. This is where the problem is with Russia. When they found all that oil under the ocean in Siberia, they were the only one country that knows how to get that kind of oil out of the ocean, and that's the U.S. The Russians made a deal with Exxon before to remove all that oil. However, the sanctions against Russia got started and yada, 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 basically ended that entire project. The interesting thing is, why are most of the really big possible oil reserves underwater in the Philippines? Why can't the Philippines find any on dry land? Well, the most interesting thing I found out is how oil comes to be in the first place. Now, we all think that oil comes from dinosaurs, that they die and then over time they turn into oil. So if that's true, then why is there so much oil underwater? Dinosaurs didn't live underwater. I mean, there were some swimming dinosaurs, but for the most part, they lived on land. It's true, oil does come from organic materials, however, not just from dinos, but from everything. The problem with land is that much organic material can just blow away or is washed away with rain. Remember, we're talking about millions of years for something to turn into oil. Also, we have to remember that most of the oil originated from that time that we use now millions and millions of years ago. Many of the oil reserves we find under land were not land at all at the time, but rather the ocean. It turns out that the ocean is the best place for oil to procure. So much of the oil we find was originally underwater. I mean, unfortunately that we can't make oil, but we can't. So it must come naturally from the earth. And getting it is still not that easy. First problem is you have to find it. You have to go down thousands of feet underwater. Then you may have to drill tens of thousands of feet to get the oil. Obviously, this is a very expensive thing to do. Some oil rigs are billions of dollars to set up, and the science of knowing exactly where to drill is not completely exact. Finding the oil first can be a bit of a gamble. If it were easy, the Philippines would already have oil wells everywhere. But the good part about this is that the Philippines solves the problem of finding oil and can solve the problem of its domestic need for it. Right now in places like Qatar, they have enough gasoline to run their Lamborghinis for 100,000 years. So they must sell their oil. But the price of oil goes up and down. And the price per barrel is related to how much they will drill. If the cost of drilling a barrel is the same price as the barrel, then there's no point in doing it at all. So you only drill based on what the price is. Now, in the future, the price is going to become so low that it will no longer be profitable to drill oil, electric cars and stuff. This, of course, probably after I will be dead and buried. But for now, this is not the problem of the Philippines because that's not really the purpose of finding the oil. The main purpose is to take away the problem of importing commodities so that the Philippines does not have to rely so much on outside exports for everything. Right now, the Philippines could be sitting on a little oil, a lot of oil, or no oil. But many believe that there is at least something there. Philippines will never be able to find out if it's on its own, rather, if it needs to have a partner. Who is that partner going to be? They must have a partner. What kind of fight will the Philippines need to go through in order to get what's theirs to begin with? And who knows what's there? The Philippines could very well be a super rich country, or could just continue to guess about what could be buried underneath it. This is Eric Lecain on the World News Jam, right here on DZRJ and RJTV, in a discussion about the most interesting stories of the week. So, Indonesia had two big earthquakes recently. One was 5.6 magnitude earthquake on the main island of Java. Now, you probably are saying, well, 5.6, that's not so bad. Philippines, we have way worse earthquakes. But more than 300 people died from this quake. Sometimes it's not always the magnitude that determines the destructive power of a quake, but where and how it happens. There's also how close to the surface. What is the infrastructure like, and exactly where does the fault line lay? The biggest problem in Indonesia was that many of the buildings were not earthquake-proof, not even close. The main school, the hospital, many public facilities were heavily damaged because of the way they were constructed. Now, there is a fault line directly underneath the city that was hit. And when one fault line shifts, the other side will slip out of sync, and that's when you can have the most shaking and the worst damage. This particular place has the most fault lines of any place in the entire area. So this is a factor in the number of deaths in the area over an earthquake zone. As we have talked about before, Indonesia is in the middle of the Ring of Fire, the 40,000-kilometer stretch that lies in the Pacific Basin. It's where the majority of the world's earthquakes happen. This is why we have so many in the Philippines. Indonesia also has earthquakes on a regular basis, but this one was especially cruel. If you remember back in 2004, during the Indian Ocean quake, the following tsunami that happened, 230,000 people died, most of which were in Indonesia. Some of the smaller islands were completely wiped clean of homes, buildings, and people, just in an instant. Now, this earthquake we have been talking about happened in the last week of November. However, another earthquake hit in a nearby area just last week, and that was a 6.1 magnitude. However, that was not as bad as far as injuries and damage. But the real second earthquake I was talking about in the beginning was in Indonesian parliament this week. Now, this week, they did was pass a long-expected revision. Yet still, this revision was like an earthquake-level shocking of the penal code. First of all, they passed a law that criminalizes sex outside of marriage. You know, the good kind. That's a joke, by the way. The law covers everyone: high school sweethearts, gay people, lesbians, office lovers. This also includes foreigners. They have also prohibited the promotion of contraception. So who knows? Maybe there's going to be an increase in babies soon there. And also, they now forbid progressive political thought and a ban on any defamation of the president and state institutions. There's also an amendment code that expands the existing blasphemy law and maintains a 5-year prison term for deviants from the 6 religions that are recognized there: Islam, Christian, Catholicism, Hinduism, Buddhism, and Confucianism. And bonus, if you're associated with any organization that follows Marxist-Leninist ideology, you can get a 10-year sentence. And if you spread any type of communist propaganda, you can get a 4-year sentence. All this happened in Parliament just this week. So let's unpack some of this. Now, I know what you're saying. As far as the sex law, a lot of this will depend on how much they decide to enforce it. 2 college kids are in love, and one is a Christian, one is a Muslim, and they are secretly having sex. Are they both going to jail? And what if there's a jealous friend of the girl? Even if they didn't have sex, she claims that they did. Is there going to be a trial for every single case? The law says that you cannot cohabitate with someone of the opposite sex if you are not married to them. So, no live-in lover. And if you want to bring your Filipino girlfriend on a Bali vacation, are you subject to arrest if she stays in your room? What's that going to do to the hotel industry there? Will no one want to come, or will you guys need to get 2 rooms in a hotel? And of course, since gay marriage is not legal, does that mean that you can have a gay relationship but with no sex involved? Good luck with that. And if 2 guys stay in a hotel together, who is to decide if they are having sex in there? By the way, there was a provision in the new law that made homosexuality illegal in Indonesia, but after deliberations, it was for some reason removed. Reading through the list of laws, I found that the things like adultery must be lodged by either the spouse, the parents, or the children. So this stops the nosy neighbor from constantly sending in complaints. However, it does open the door for a mother-in-law to finally get rid of her daughter's deadbeat husband. The issue being that the no sex, unless you're married law, is very broad and very vague. It can mean so many different things. And what, pray tell, are they going to do about the brothels? I mean, prostitution in Indonesia is a pretty big business. Many women rely on that line of work to feed their families. How could the government possibly arrest all of them? And by the way, sex outside of marriage is 1 year in jail for each count and 6 months if you're just sleeping in the same room. Even if they figure a workaround for this, there's a lot of people that are going to think twice before taking a chance to visit Indonesia. Let's move on to speaking openly about the president and the vice president. Well, you can't. Protesters, comedians, newscasters, they have to reconsider what they might say because it can lead to a 3-year jail sentence. Now, the thing is that this is also very broad. You can all of a sudden turn in your neighbor because once you heard them say the president is an idiot. So in order to be guilty of this law, the complainant must come from the president himself. And what is considered an insult to the president? That's an interesting question. I'm just assuming that this is geared toward any type of protest regarding the president. But this is near the same as with many countries, such as Russia, Saudi Arabia. By the way, in Russia, it specifically says you cannot draw lipstick on the president or make him look feminine in any way. But having a specific law in the books like this in Indonesia does make it difficult for anyone, especially political opponents and news stations, to ever criticize the president in any way. Which leads to the last part about religion. Of course, Indonesia has multiple religions, Islam being very prominent. However, this gives the government a way to use religion in its fight against communism. The problem here is that it does give the government an opening to discriminate against minorities. If you're not one of the 6 recognized religions, or you say you're an atheist, you could run into issues if you speak opposingly to religion, or if you're a rural tribe that does not conform to one of the 6 religions that they say that you must. Does that mean you are now not legal in Indonesia? Anyway, here are just some of the issues that Indonesia is going to have to figure out. When you make broad, sweeping legislation over a whole country, which involves things that do not conform with the rest of the world, you're going to have some problems. I understand the reasoning behind a ban on things like progressive thought and why they feel that they need it. However, the biggest question, who gets to decide on what is progressive and what is blasphemy and what, except can there be to an all-out ban on sex outside of marriage? I have a feeling a lot of this is going to be coming down to how each of these laws is going to be manipulated. And this is where things can get very dangerous. This is Eric Lecain here on the World News Jam, talking about the most interesting stories going on in the world this week. Well, this week, many people were in shock, as was me, as Brittany Griner, the WNBA basketball star, was freed from a Russian prison. Now, for those of you that follow the show, we have talked about Brittany many times. We went through her arrest in the Russian airport for carrying a vaping cartridge with less than 0.5 gram of cannabis oil. Now, not only is marijuana or something like it illegal in Russia, anything that is remotely similar can get you jail time. And since literally no one ever wins a criminal trial in Russia, it means the conviction rate is almost 100%. So when Brittany went to trial, as we all guessed, she was found guilty of drug trafficking. Now, let me reiterate, she had a vaping cartridge with less than 1 gram of cannabis oil in it. And she was sentenced to 9 years for that. Now, in Russia, you don't exactly go to prison. The prisons are really work camps where, for the women, you sew clothes for the military and the police. Now, these camps are very well known for being some of the harshest prisons on earth. Many people don't survive these prisons, as many are on the freezing northern part of Russia, and there is disease and starvation and torture. Let's just say it's pretty bad. Brittany was sentenced to one of those. However, she could appeal the ruling, which she did. How do you think that came out? Well, just as you thought. Her appeal was denied, and she was sent off to prison. For a while, we did not even know where they sent her. But later it was confirmed that she went to one of the worst prison camps in Russia called the IK2 in Mordovia. Now, through this whole ordeal, there was always the chance for a prisoner swap. The problem was, who would the Russians want back? one of the worst wanted criminals in the world, Victor Bout. That's who they wanted. He was serving 25 years in the United States for selling Russian military weapons to anyone that would pay for them. He was known for selling weapons to one side of a conflict and then selling similar weapons to the other side. The Congo, Central America, Afghanistan, even the Abu Sayyaf here in the Philippines. He was one of the world's most wanted people for years. However, the U.S. intelligence finally set up a sting operation trying to buy surface-to-air missiles from him, and that finally got him there in Thailand. Now, even though he was known for doing some really bad stuff, they eventually convicted him for conspiracy to kill Americans, which he got 25 years for that. Now, this guy was known as the Merchant of Death and had many good friends in Russia, most notably Vladimir Putin, and they wanted him back. However, the U.S. didn't want to give him up. But, of course, Russia also had some American prisoners, so that was always a possibility of a swap for that guy. One such prisoner was a guy named Paul Whelan. He was a U.S. Marine who was accused of espionage in Russia, a charge that many believe, as I do, was completely fabricated. Now, he got 16 years in a Russian penal colony back in 2020 for that. For a while, the U.S. government was negotiating a swap for him and the illegal arms guy in the U.S., but the negotiations fell apart at one point and it never happened. Then when Brittany, another very high-profile American, got sent to prison there was a possibility that they might use her to do a prison swap. But once she was sent to the penal colony, it didn't really seem like there was much hope of anything happening for her either. I mean, once we found that she had already been moved, it really seemed like the end for her. But then out of the blue this week, we got word that a resolution had come up and the Russians had decided they would accept a trade arms dealer for Brittany. Now, to anyone out there that seemed like a very uneven swap, Brittany is arguably the most famous basketball player in the world, and she was caught with a vape cartridge. This guy is one of the most wanted people in the world for selling illegal Russian arms to the highest bidder. I mean, he had planes to move his weapons around the world and literally created wars by selling arms to both sides of a conflict. Well, it seemed like the Americans thought this was, too much. So they were trying to get more bang for the prisoner buck. So they were asking for two not so guilty Americans for one really, really guilty Russian. And no deal. The Russians said, you can have Brittany for Borsch, but that's it. So the Americans had a decision to make: either get something or get nothing. The word came from the president. He decided at least get one prisoner as opposed to none. Now, of course, there's more to this than what you just see. The speculation that the only reason the Russians did this is because of the problems it might cause the U.S. government and how they can create chaos and more division in the U.S. And clearly, that plan worked out very well once the swap was announced, and it did not include the American Marine. The right-wing TV shows and people like Donald Trump fell for it hook, line, and sinker. They immediately came out to say that the Biden administration had a choice to pick between a black lesbian woman or a white straight male. And of course, they took the black woman. The Democrats don't care if a white Marine is left in a prison as long as they get headlines for getting a black lesbian out. This is exactly what the Russians were hoping for. Anything they could do to create more animosity between Americans, the better. But in reality, having the Marine be a part of the swap was never even on the table. His case and situation in Russia is very different than Brittany Griner. Behind the scenes, at one point, the Russians said, okay, we'll give him back, Paul Whelan and Brittany, but you got to give us this other prisoner in Germany being held for assassination. This guy, in broad daylight, he shot and killed a German citizen. No question. He is well known as an assassin for the Russian government. The Americans talked to the Germans about the possibility, but the Germans would not even discuss this. This man is in prison for murder. And what would this do for Germany? Anyway, the final deal was pretty lopsided, but at least the government was able to get Brittany Griner home. The ordeal, of course, is far from over. When we all watch at the Saudi airport when the swap was made, it was really right out of a movie. It's now made it very clear that all Russia needs to do is grab Americans, and then they immediately have leverage to swap them for hardcore Russian criminals. I mean, picked about average 2,500 torpedoes, 76,000 AK-47s, 1,700 assault rifles, 2,500 grenade launchers per month. Brittany Griner averaged 14 points and 8 rebounds per game. This is something every American needs to think about as they decide to travel to Russia. You might get swiped and swapped. And all the while just hoping that you're valuable enough to be traded. This is Eric Lecain here on the World News Jam on DZRJ and RJTV, talking about stories going on around the world. Okay, let's get into some U.S. news. Now, of course, you can't get out of talking about Donald Trump because he always manages to somehow keep himself in the news somehow. You know, the old slogan, any news is good news, but sometimes, like in this week, I'm not sure if that rings true because Trump had a tough week. In the 14-count indictment against Trump's organization for tax fraud, the verdict was guilty on all counts. Trump, who has always made himself out to be a masterful, clever businessman, has actually been cheating the government all along. Now, of course, he calls all this stuff a witch hunt and is a politically motivated, and to some extent, I don't know, I guess he might be right. I mean, if he was not president before, and by that I mean a hated president, he probably would not be going through all this right now. There most likely would not be a vast scope of criminal charges looming over his head on a constant basis. But he was the president, and many people hated him. So he will be investigated probably until he finally goes off to jail. And his sons, and his daughter, and son-in-law, and anyone that has close ties to him would go to jail. The Trump Organization was found guilty. The CFO of Trump's company will do some time in jail. However, Trump himself has squeezed out of that. Basically, the brunt of the case is that they had a long-running scheme in place, lowering people's pay and then making it up later so as not to pay taxes on it. So in other words, lower someone's salary from like $200,000 to $140,000, then give them a car, pay their rent. Then the company writes it off as an expense. Seems pretty smart, but it's also very illegal. Didn't take the jury very long to figure it out that the company was guilty on all 14 counts. Now, in the scheme of things, this is really small potatoes. They will pay a fine, and only the CFO will do jail time. However, what it did was open the door for other prosecutions. Trump signed off on most of the scheme that was illegal, so basically his fingerprints are everywhere for sanctioning tax fraud. Now, this is not the tax fraud suit brought on by the New York State Attorney General's office. This has to do with Trump's inflating assets when he needed to get a loan and deflating them when he needed to pay taxes. And somehow the check writing of the porn star to keep her quiet about the rolled up magazine spanking that she gave Trump. And that can result in a criminal charge. So you probably would think that this would be the worst thing that happened this week for Trump, but maybe the loss of his candidate, Herschel Walker, might have a little more sting to it. Trump's top pick for the Senate in Georgia was his football and a contestant on his show, The Apprentice, Herschel Walker. Now, as I have said, Herschel was not considered a stellar possibility. His biggest problem was that his background was never thoroughly vetted. And during the campaign, several past girlfriends came forward to mention the fact that Herschel had gotten them pregnant and forced them to get an abortion. Now, there's nothing wrong with that, except when you're a Republican and you are clearly anti-abortion, and you were married to another woman at the time that you got these women pregnant, and then Herschel denied it, and then he had to not deny it. But probably what hurt Herschel more was that he was just, not smart. Eventually, everyone figured out that Herschel had no business being a senator and was pushed into the spotlight as a way for Republicans to say that they were not racist, bigoted white people. I mean, Georgia is a Republican state, and it's not that hard to get elected there, no matter how bad you are if you're white and you're running against a black preacher. But Herschel was not white and would open his mouth, and that really began to hurt his chances. Sometimes it was just senseless babble, like when he talked about always wanting to be a vampire, except now watching a movie and finding that werewolves can kill vampires, so now he wants to be a werewolf. And it didn't help that Barack Obama came out and said that he had the same thoughts, but when he was 7 years old. In any case, he was Trump's guy, and he lost, as did almost all of Trump's hand-picked candidates. I just want to point out that Herschel's loss was not by much. Like I said, if the Republicans would have picked any white, male, boring candidate, they would have won easily. However, now many are blaming Trump for the massive losses in this Senate run. But Trump fired back in what Trump knows, that one thing that no one can resist, and that is a distraction. When everyone is looking at the really bad things, then you say something so crazy that everyone can't help but take their focus off the real important stuff. Now, of course, last week, Trump had dinner with a Holocaust denier and a rapper wannabe president who calls himself a Nazi. But this week, Trump said that the U.S. Constitution should be terminated. That all the rules and regulations stated in the Constitution should be put on hold so that he can be, and rightfully should be returned to the White House as the president. Now, of course, that is absurd and will never happen. However, it did something that Trump needed. Everyone looked away from all the really bad stuff. Now, Republicans who thought Trump's dinner was not the best idea didn't really have much to say about Trump wanting to terminate the Constitution, which means that even if Trump is packed with all kinds of problems, the Republicans are not quite ready to go on a limb and condemn Trump yet. They are still worried about his base of supporters, which are ready to and willing to go down with the Trump ship, no matter how far it sinks. Now, Trump before used to boast at how much he loved the Constitution. However, when he needs to, he will easily call for it to be thrown out. Now, if you try to imagine if Obama or Joe Biden or Hillary Clinton would have said that, the Republicans would want to bring back burning at the stake. So as it stands now, Trump this week, he is guilty of 14 counts of fraud. His candidate has lost, and he wants the U.S. Constitution thrown out so he can be president again. Pretty typical week, I guess. And this is Eric Lecain here on the World News Jam on DZRJ Radio and RJTV. You know, overthrowing your government. That sounds like the new thing to do these days, overthrowing governments. It's been going on since the Roman times. But these days, I don't know, it just seems kind of out of touch, except maybe for places like West Africa. But still, it happens from time to time, or at least it tries to, even places that you would think would be impossible, such as the United States. On January 6th, people rose up against the newly elected government and thought they would overthrow it. They got thousands together, marched on the Capitol. They overran it. The goal was to kill people in the government, install Donald Trump as their leader. Democracy to them doesn't work unless, of course, they are the winners. Their king told them that if they were to lose, then he was cheated by the horrible, scandalous left-wing liberals. But much of this is maybe not happening around the world, but this overthrowing of a government seems to be on the minds of people everywhere. Some believe that the legally and duly elected government in their country is what's causing all the hardships. That because of the immigrants and the weak-minded politicians that let criminals run through the streets, that they need to make a change. Not by voting, but with guns and violence. This is much how autocrats get themselves elected. No one cares for you. No one is helping you. Your country is being taken over by foreigners. At that point, people begin to believe that maybe democracy is not what they need. Maybe they need a strong man who will fight for them, even though they must give up their freedoms. This was not that far what happened in Germany in 1930. There was an economic crisis, and Germany could not pay its war debts, and that's the debts that were stipulated in the Versailles Peace Treaty. Millions of the Germans lost their jobs, and there were problems with food and supply shortages. But there was one man in the German Nationalistic Social Workers' Party who said that he could fix it. He had actually tried to overthrow the government before in 1923. However, he did not have the support he needed, and he failed. But in 1930, his ability to sow fear in the hearts of Germans ended up being his ticket to being their leader. His name, of course, was Adolf Hitler. The Nazis had a clear idea of how to take over the country, show how the government's leaders were too liberal, how the Jews had stolen everything from the Germans, and that Hitler was the only way that the people could get their Germany back. He must take full control and kill anyone that stands in the way of his authoritarianism. Well, this past week, Germany almost had a taste of what that could mean today. Maximilian Eder and his right-wing extremist party, the Reichsbürger Party, also pulled off almost a coup in Germany. The idea was they'd create blackouts across Germany. They would storm the government building and handcuff the leaders and turn the public against them. The coup plotters were not exactly what you might think. A bunch of doctors and judges and gourmet chef and opera singer, a few hardcore revolutionaries. They had a plan to take down the government and install themselves as the leaders. They had times, schedules, the government leader, when they would hit first, who they would hit first, also how they would take over the government buildings. They had insiders helping them, some ex-police, ex-military. But did it ever have a chance? Would they have ever been able to pull off something as big as a government coup? Well, we will never know, because this past week they were all arrested as the ringleaders. But over the past year, these people had been gathering a lot of support from the public. They are from the conspiracy groups that marched against vaccines. And in the wake of the catastrophic floods they had in Germany, they made statements on how they knew how to save the Germans. Supposedly they were part of the QAnon circles and were very able to utilize all the members of QAnon in Germany. But the real group was the Reichsbürger, or the citizens of the right, as they are called. It's based on the idea of the Federal Republic of Germany does not legally exist, but actually was created by the Allied forces after World War II to enforce the interests of the victorious powers. According to the conspiracy, the German Reich still exists because Germany's basic law is not a real constitution. Never mind that it's been widely accepted for decades. The real ideological background of this group is very different conspiracy theory, well known as the Citizens of the Reich. What really makes this crude movement, which makes its own uniforms, makes their own passports, makes their own money, they're so dangerous that it intersects with all sorts of other groups against the government. A coalition of right-wing radicals who are anti-vaccination, anti-refugee, pro-Russia. And thanks in part to this, it even has parliamentary representation in the form of the Alternative for Germany, or the AfD. The party has 10% of the vote in the government and is even stronger in the polls. In some states in the east of the country, it competes with the Christian Democratic Union, which is the party of the former Chancellor Angela Merkel. Remember when I said there were judges involved? There was a woman judge arrested one of the plotters. She was an AfD member before, kind of the Marjorie Taylor Greene of Germany, very anti-immigrant. She was supposed to be the new justice minister. The group wanted to make Prince Heinrich VIII of Rus, a descendant of the fallen royal line, the new head of state, a former right-wing member of the Bundestag. But alas, they will not be able to overthrow the government because they were all caught. The government found out about the plot, and that was the end of that. But the fact that they got so close to pulling it off, just like the U.S. people, you don't realize how close Trump's radical group came to really overthrowing the government. The problem with doing a coup, though, is that you can't just assume that because people don't like the government, they're going to back you in the end. If you don't have the military at your back, then you have a problem, because that means that the group in power does have the military at their back. And in the end, you are not going to take on the military of a country and win. You think they will back you, but 9 times out of 10, they will not. So as this kind of thing continues to happen across the world, and more authoritarians are placed at the presidential desks, we start to see that these Hitler types are a lot more popular than we thought. And it's then that we start to see, well, just how Hitler got there in the first place. This is Eric Lecain on the World News Jam on DZRJ Radio and RJ TV. We are bringing you interesting stories going on around the world, some stuff that happened this week that I believe that everybody should know. There's a word I keep hearing lately: domestic terrorism. Now, I know when you think of terrorists, you generally think of someone Arab, right? Or someone Muslim. Just kind of become a stereotype of what a terrorist is. But what about people in your own country who are terrorist people that are from a political party that want to create havoc or confusion? I guess you could say the guys that stormed the U.S. Capitol, tried to overthrow the government, they were terrorists. But none of them were Arabs or Muslims. They were mostly white, male, Christian types. But terrorism comes in all kinds of shapes and sizes and forms. For instance, this week, someone broke in and shot up a bunch of electrical transformers in the state of North Carolina. They did it in the middle of the night. Nobody got hurt. Nobody died. They just shot up a bunch of transformers with high-powered rifles. Now, was this someone who was drunk and going crazy, or was this someone that hated transformers? Or maybe it was someone with a plan. Why? Because whoever it was knew exactly where to shoot. They knew the spot to inflict the most damage possible. Now, what could be the reason for this? Thinking back in California, 2013, in the town of San Jose, in the middle of the night, someone crawled into an underground electrical tunnel and cut an AT&T fiber optic telecommunications cable. They cut it in such a way that it would be impossible or very hard to repair. Then 9 minutes later, they did it again in another nearby station. Some kind of tunnel with exactly the same kind of wiring, cut in the exact same way. So the internet went down, phones went down, 911 went down. There was an emergency. People had to go to the hospital, the police, the fire station themselves to get help. Then, 23 minutes after these fiber optics were cut, someone went to the electrical substation with a gun and started shooting at the transformers. Now here again, they knew exactly where to shoot. Many of the bullets went into the oil-filled cooling system that caused the electrical boxes to overheat and melt down. Over 52,000 gallons of oil leaked out, and then the transformers began to melt. They knocked out 17 giant transformers that funneled power to Silicon Valley. All in all, it took the would-be cutters and shooters 1 hour to do all this damage. It took 27 days to repair it. Why? Why? What would be the motive for doing something like this? The people responsible were never caught. Then several years later, again, another group, electrical grids, they were disrupted in much the very same way, except this time they caught them. Turned out to be a couple of white supremacists. They had the idea that if they could get the electricity knocked out to a large portion of the country, that the people would get mad. They would create civil unrest, and the minorities would riot and create havoc. At this point, the white people would have a reason to rise up and take over the country. The plan was to go around the country bringing down electrical grids. The thought that because the power was out, that no one would ever show up to work, that the economy would fall apart and chaos would ensue, and in the middle, a new, stronger race of white people would be all that was left. They would create a massive explosion that would keep the police and the fire department busy for a time while they would systematically destroy the electrical grids. In case you worried if this was just talk, well, they had already bought explosives, were testing different combinations. They were practicing with their AR-15 assault rifles, which they were assembling themselves so as not to have serial numbers on them. They also found a lot of Nazi-related materials, videos, books, images, books and details on U.S. power infrastructure, lists of where power substations were and how they were operated, and an article about that sabotage of the power station in San Jose, California. Anyway, they were found guilty in an Ohio court. In North Carolina, just this past week, 45,000 households were completely out of power. This is not like a storm where cables break or pop out and then the electrical crews can go in and fix them. In North Carolina, 2 electrical substations were shot up with high-powered rifles. You can't just go and fix that. These 2 stations were about 10 miles apart and in a very rural area of North Carolina. Because of the way it was done and how the shooters knew exactly what they were shooting at, the authorities are calling it an act of domestic terrorism. That the intent was to knock out as much electrical power as possible. Officials are looking at different motives. However, the state's Senate said that this was a terrible act and it appears to be an intentional, willful, and malicious act. They said that they knew that if they did this, there would be no way to reroute the power like what would happen in a storm. They went to the 2 substations in the rural area because taking both out would make sure that there was no way to move people from one to the other. You can't cook, can't turn on your TV. Many people's water shut off because they couldn't use the electrical pumps. Cell phones don't work, and if there is an emergency, it's difficult to get help. Right now, the FBI is looking at a thread on certain forums on the internet that there may be a connection between an LGBTQ event and the shooters. North Carolina does not have a large gay community. However, there was a drag queen event happening at the same time that the power went out. Currently, there is a $45,000 reward for any knowledge on that attack. You know, after seeing this, I have been looking at some interesting stories all around the U.S., very similar attacks going on. If you look at what happened in North Carolina, it has crippled the economy in that area. 600 restaurants had to close down, schools, communication companies. This has created a huge problem in that area. If you think about it, it's probably one of the easiest, best ways to cause the most damage in a huge area. You know, burning down a building just damages that building, but shutting down several towns for weeks? And what happens when the power is out at the start of winter? What do you do with all the people? How do you feed them? How do you keep them warm? And of course, it's going to affect the poor minorities more than any. It is one of the best plans of terrorism I think there is. And you can do it, and no one is around to see you do it. Some people just like to see the world burn. Or in this case, some just like to see it dark. This is Eric Lecain here on the World News Jam on DZRJ Radio and RJTV. We're out of time here, but I would like to thank you for joining us this week, discussing some of the most interesting things going on around the world. I hope you will join us next week. So for me, Eric Lecain, and all of us here at DZRJ, everyone, please be safe out there. We'll see you next time.
The views and comments